Okay, let's talk about a little bit about design and development. Because I think probably a lot of designers and a lot of developers they're maybe a little scared of each other, right? They're like, at a dance when the girls and the boys are kind of at the at on the walls, and they're looking at each other and they're like, whoa, what's this weird people. So I think we should talk more. There should be more discussion between tech people and design people. And one thing that's always, what one probably the most obvious thing to talk about is because where we interact the most is the handoff between the stuff that I put together, the assets, or however I'm trying to make my design intentions clear. What does that look like? What do the developers need? Because I think a lot of designers, UI designers, graphic designers, they've never really done any code, right? And they don't really understand how you do a layout in like HTML or like in Android or whatever. And so, okay, here's one specific thing we can kind of start the discussion on. So I think I've seen this for 10 years since I started doing design at RBC. Is part of the handoff. So let's say you do a design with a mock-up, and this is how the screen is going to go. Especially, I remember at RBC, this has probably changed now. This is a few years at RBC, but I've seen this in a lot of design handoffs, where, for example, they're giving like pixel sizes of like, okay, this button is going to be 80 pixels big, and it's going to have 20 pixels of space, and this font is going to be this pixel size. And I think as someone who has a little teeny bit of development experience, I think that's not the way you want to go. I think you want to be more relative in how a designer describes their intentions to the developer. What do you think about that? Am I out to lunch?
Yeah, no, I mean, so the pixel way of communicating design is a really old way of looking at it. It doesn't take into effect the different form factors that your new design was actually going to live in. Because if we're talking about web, for example, I might have something that sits on a browser and somebody's widescreen monitor, but the same design has to work well on a mobile app. It might have to work as a web design, or it might be on someone's TV. People might be browsing their the website on the TV, or these days even a car. The the response to this is responsive design, where you're trying to look at things with less of a hard mentality of like numbers, and more about like, okay, well, how can we design with a flow? And to touch back on like how the handoff works is usually with we don't rely on one set of tools, or whereas before we would just get not screen grabs, but like mock-ups made in like Photoshop or whatever. This is what it should look like. These days we work with tools like InVision or
Figma.
Figma, yeah, and we see live versions of the app, a prototype version, where not only do you have the actual visualization of what it might be, we have different variations of that screen, or we'll have places where the designer just leaves comments, and we can comment back and we can communicate, because it's not the old school way of thinking of the designer has a design and the developers have to implement it and that's it, we move on. I found that the most successful projects I've worked on have always been when there's a tight collaboration with the designers and the developers. The best ones have always been where I'm communicating as a developer to the designers almost every single day. They are educating the developers in terms of user experience and user flow and intent. And conversely, the developers will inform the design decisions based on constraints that the application might have to work around.
Right, like I mean,
So like,
it's a negotiation almost, right? Because like as a designer, you have all these like wants and like, oh, I want this cool thing to fucking come in and spin around and like jump on this thing and it's gonna be so awesome, and then you're like, dude, that's gonna take me fucking 4 weeks to make. Do you really want that? And then I'm like, well, maybe. You know what I mean?
So that's the I love that you brought it up. Like, yeah, it'll take 4 weeks to make, because that's usually like the constraints that designers will be thinking of. Whereas we'll also think about like, well, how much is this going to affect the user's data usage? How much is this going to affect the user's battery? Right. Also things like, well, what are we thinking of in terms of smaller devices, right? Or what are we thinking of if they were to run this on a tablet? Also, this is gonna take me 4 fucking weeks to make, man. Like,
Yeah.
so like all of the above, right?
Yeah.
So like,
so I must say, I think our team had a pretty good back and forth, right? We were always we were a little bit loose with the design a little bit. Like we left some, not gaps, but we didn't specify some things. And then if the gap was too big for you to just bridge yourself, you'd reach out, say, hey, what should this be? And we'd be like, oh, and we'd tell you, and then we'd go. And I think it worked out pretty well.
yeah, like I've worked for companies where the design was set in stone, and whether or not it worked, if you said 6 pixels, it would have to be 6 pixels. Whereas when you actually implement that, it just does not look good. It doesn't work. The user can't touch it. The way we've worked is more along the lines of like, well, this is what I intend. Work with me. Help me figure out the way we're going to actually make it work. And the best part was where if I don't understand, you're still there. You haven't left and like dropped the design off and like walked away. You were literally down the hall.
Yeah, exactly. Like I can tell you my intent. Like, okay, I need this to be like this, so that the user doesn't have to go back and forth 10 times to do this thing. And you're like, okay, well, we could do that with a native component that would take 1 second to do versus this cockamamie thing that you have, which would take 2 weeks to do. And so I think a lot of that is missing in the process, right? Yeah. Cool.
I think that a lot of it also comes from, like you said, a fear of talking to people that are different. There's a lot of designers that don't want to talk to developers that don't want to talk to designers. Whereas the best teams I've worked on, the designers and developers not only go hand in hand, but so do the PMs and the testers. And it's something where like you can't work in silos, and you have to collaborate at every step of the way. And there's no one set group of people that are exactly right, 100% correct. And it's only through that collaboration and figuring out where we're wrong do we find that that middle ground where the actual correct answer comes from.
Yeah. Or at least as close to ideal as we can get, given all the constraints and considerations, let's say.
Yeah. Compromise is where everybody's unhappy, right?
Right. Well, that's the other side, that you can't let it get that, because there's like, compromise and working together, but then there's like, man, the security team totally fucked over the experience now, so I got to put in a 30 character password that I forget every time. So, I think sometimes there's still room for battles.
Yeah. I can,
right?
Yeah.
But I get, especially with developers and designers should be best buds. They gotta be like right there together and kind of working together. Otherwise it's just gonna be garbage comes out.
I've also been on teams where you'll have the product manager lead everything, and usually when it comes down to it, those teams will start to open up where initially you're not allowed to talk to designers. You're not allowed to talk to QA. You're not allowed to talk to business, because that's the PM's job, which is fine. But if you want to get things done and you don't want one person to be that bottleneck, well, you got to open it up to collaboration.
Right. But that takes a little bit of trust. Trust but verify, Trust but verify.
I've also found that being data-driven is usually the best route to success. You test, right? you do user experience testing, you use mocks, you use prototypes. InVision was really good for that. Or even just like those, I don't know what you call those tests where you'll have a screenshot of a screen and then you'll say, okay, well, what would you click here if you're trying to get to wherever? And then, oh, you click there? Hold on, let me get to you another image and like show that. Where it's like a really, really low level prototype,
Yeah.
just collecting the data. Click test, I guess, right? That sort of thing is integral for building trust, because it's not that developers are necessarily data driven. We say we are, but we're humans too. We have emotions. So like by creating those tests, you're creating trust for the design, the developer, for business. And this is how we figure out which solutions are actually solutions, right? As opposed to just features that we want.
Yeah. Yeah, makes sense, man.